Many traits and disorders in humans and other organisms are genetic in origin and follow Mendel's laws of inheritance. These traits are often controlled by a single pair of alleles on the autosomal chromosomes. In autosome is any chromosome other than a sex chromosome. For now, we're just going to be studying the patterns of inheritance associated with these individual chromosomes. Genetic disorders that are caused by autosomes are called autosomal disorders. So some disorders, genetic disorders, are autosomal dominant, meaning that an individual who has both dominant alleles is going to have the disorder. An individual who is heterozygous for the disorder will also have the disorder. And an individual who is autosomal recessive, and an individual who is homozygous recessive will not have the disorder. But there are other genetic disorders that are autosomal recessive, meaning that they're only going to be found on the recessive trait. Now, the interesting thing about these is that an individual who is homozygous dominant is not going to have the disorder, but an individual who is heterozygous won't have the disorder, but they will be considered a carrier for that particular genetic condition. And an individual who is homozygous recessive will have the disorder. A great example of this would be cystic fibrosis. Cystic fibrosis is an autosomal recessive disorder. Only about 1 in 20 individuals is a carrier for the disorder. So about 1 in 20 individuals is going to be heterozygous for this trait, but only 1 in 2,000 will actually have the disorder, because it's very rare that an individual will be homozygous recessive for this particular disorder. So here is just an example of an autosomal recessive pedigree. If an individual who has the particular disorder, so let's just say that this disorder is cystic fibrosis. If we have an individual who has cystic fibrosis and we cross them with another individual who may or may not have it, or does not have it, may or may not be a carrier for it, we can actually see how this gets played out through the generations. We have an entire generation where nobody has it, no individuals have it. We also see that even the third generation, no individual has it. We don't see it reappear until the fourth generation when we cross a heterozygous individual with another heterozygous individual. Now, the interesting thing with autosomal recessive disorders is a lot of times they appear, specifically, a great example of this would be hemophilia. Hemophilia appears in the royal bloodline because there is so much sort of inbreeding. They try to keep trying to marry off royal family members to each other, and when you do this, there's a much greater chance that autosomal recessive genetic disorders will make an appearance. So autosomal recessive disorders and patterns of inheritance. If both parents carry one copy of a recessive gene, they are going to be unaffected, but they are capable of having a child with 2 copies of the gene who would be affected. Like I said, there are several disorders out there. Methemoglobinemia, there we go. It's a relatively harmless disorder. It's an accumulation of methemoglobin in the blood, and it causes the skin to appear sort of a bluish purple. It is an example of an autosomal recessive disorder. We have hemoglobin in our blood that is to be our carriers of oxygen. But with this disorder, the hemoglobin is converted very slowly to methemoglobin. It's just a bluish form of the protein, and it can't convert it back. It's essentially harmless. It just leads to sort of that bluish tint. But eventually it was discovered and a treatment was found, and that's just simply an injection of methylene blue. It's a dye that we use in this class all the time. But it can't, what it does is it functions as an electron donor. Once there's an excess of electrons available in the blood, the methemoglobin was able to convert back to hemoglobin, and the skin pinks up immediately. Cystic fibrosis, the most common autosomal recessive disorder that is lethal, is cystic fibrosis. About 1 in 20 individuals are carriers, about 1 in 2,000 have the disorder. Cystic fibrosis is caused by a defective chloride channel carrier protein. It's encoded by the genes CFTR on chromosome 7. Research has shown that the chloride ions just can't pass through the defective channels on the plasma membrane. If these chlorine ions cannot pass through, water molecules won't pass through either. So if we have a very high concentration of these ions inside the cell, our water likes to stay inside the cell to help keep the concentration, the salt concentration, equal on both sides of the plasma membrane. If the salt or the chloride ions cannot leave, the water will not leave either. The problem with this is that it creates an unequal concentration gradient that forces the water and sodium ions to follow. And the lack of water can cause abnormally thick and sticky mucus to build up on the lung epithelial cells, which prevents the normal function of the lungs. There have been many recent advancements in gene therapies for the treatment of cystic fibrosis that have resulted in the increased life expectancy to 35 years, but it is still ultimately a fatal disorder because it's so difficult to breathe if we don't have the lung epithelial cells performing the way that they need to.